I don't know how many of you folks just kind of wandered in because of the art walk that's happening, or how many folks knew about the show, but thank you all for coming very much, and thank you to Julie for having me for this show. It's really very much an honor. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking because there's a lot of work here, and it's quite different from each other, and probably that gives you guys questions that as you've looked around, you probably have wondered a little bit about more than what I might have to say about it. And artists talking about their work, you know, it can go a little long sometimes, so I won't. The general gist of it is, I'm an oil painter. I'm from California originally. I've worked as an illustrator for a long time, and between illustration and work, I've always kind of done my own painting as well. So the work is broken up between kind of some general figurative work over here, a lot of illustration kind of in the middle, and then a series of hardware paintings which you saw coming in. And they seem very disparate, but the thing they have in common is having grown up, child in the 80s, with a lot of the same kind of cultural touchstones as a lot of the other kids, but really, really informed by, pop cultural stuff like the Star Wars movies and tons and tons of video games. This is before everything was on demand, and we didn't have like the big video collections that kids today have necessarily. So video games were a huge part of what drove me forward, and not only entertained me, but actually inspired me to be an artist. And not only to be an artist, but to pursue the direction of the art that I did. Because certainly, one can make any kind of art they want. But the kind of art that I chose to follow in was the stuff that inspired me as a kid. So that's really what ties all this stuff together. The hardware stuff in particular is some of the newer work, and it's not everything I'm doing now, but it's kind of a project I've added, and that is not so much about the thing that inspired the work, but actually turning the art towards the things themselves, so the video game hardware itself. And like I found as I did it, that it really brings the hardware, which was the thing that you played, so you can look at the screen, wasn't, the hardware itself wasn't as important. It was a means to an end. And by painting them as still life, suddenly you actually start really noticing them and appreciating them for what they were, and they bring back all the memories at the same time. So that's really been a lot of the fun of that. That's the overview of the show. So at this point, I'd like to actually just ask if there's anyone that has any questions about that I can answer, on anything really, regarding the show. I'd be happy to answer.
Are there any particular video games that inspired you, like Nintendo or just specific ones? Or?
Yeah, I'd say my top three, because I had to think about this recently. So my top three games would be the Gauntlet arcade game, which was mid-'80s, Zelda for Nintendo 64.
Which Zelda?
Ocarina of Time. Good, that's a good question. And differentiating. And on the Dreamcast, Shenmue 2. So they're all none of them are really, really new, and I still play games, but for some reason, maybe because I don't get to sit and play them with as concentrated focus as I used to. Now it takes me months sometimes to finish a game. Maybe that emotional impact that some of the earlier games had, it's harder to achieve it now. But yeah, those are the ones. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about some of your illustrational background?
Sure.
The stuff that you've worked on?
Yeah, most of the illustration stuff that I've done, and a lot of that, like I said, is in the center section here, has been for a lot of I guess they would be in the gaming realm, broadly speaking. A few of them have appeared in mobile fantasy games. A large body of my work, a lot of it, which isn't up here actually, is a lot of stuff that I've done for Magic the Gathering over the years, and a number of things. Some of the Star Wars stuff has been published in Star Wars kind of licensed products and things like that. But all of it's kind of on that side. I've done some children's story book stuff and some book illustration as well, but all of it's more on the fantastic side of the spectrum. My favorite piece here, it's probably this one. I'm not standing here because of that. She just said this is a really good place to stand. But I think just in terms of aesthetically, what the classical realism that I kind of work towards, it's the biggest piece I've ever done, and it was probably the most engaged and challenging piece I've done. So as a result, and it succeeded for what I wanted to accomplish. So that would probably make it my favorite here. This one, the actual painting time, once I actually had my reference material together and I was ready to go, probably took about 5 very long weeks, evenings and weekends and things like that. I was living in, she said I am from California now, but I was living in New York at the time, and we lived in a very, very tiny studio apartment, 500 square feet, and I never worked this big, partly because I didn't have a studio space for it. And I realized that was kind of constraining how I was working, and I didn't want that to happen. So I decided I'm just going to do it, and I don't know how I'm going to transport it once I've done, but I just need to do this thing. So I worked in the kitchen. I moved kind of all the stuff out of the kitchen and just set up this giant, painting, leaned against the wall, and spent a month in the kitchen working on it. But it worked, and I got it done. Except in the case of things that don't exist, which are a number of the things on the wall. As much as possible, I like to work from, or at least extrapolate from, something that I've seen in real life. Whether that means having a model come to the studio and posing, or trying to get objects like fish, in which case I went to the market and actually bought fish, and had a buddy of mine who's here right now, this guy over here, Steve, happened to be in my studio at the time, and I had him basically hold fish and like pose them essentially in the air while I took photographs of them. As much as I can, especially when you're doing realism, it's important to have enough reference material so that you can sell the realism of it. And some people have, are able to just from straight out of their heads put it down in a way that's convincing. And certainly in the things that you can't get in real life, I have to fill in the blanks imaginatively. But as much as possible, I'll try to get a hold of things that help to bridge the gap between what I have to make up and what can be easily found. With a lot of the realism, there's a lot of struggle to get the thing to look the way you want it to get. And certainly the building up of technique allows and facilitates that, but at the same time, you never know, especially with kind of more fantastical stuff, you really never know if you're going to hit your goal. You might have an idea and you see it clear in your head, but that challenge of taking it from your head and expressing it and actually putting it in real life, that challenge and meeting the challenge and the thrill that happens when you actually realize a dream, essentially, is kind of one of the main motivations that keeps me going, that keeps me painting.
You have two series in here. Of course, the Hearts for Hardware series, which is the video game consoles, but you also have the Exit Within series. Can you talk a little bit about those series in terms of that piece?
There are 3 paintings out of 5 in the Exit Within series. One, and there's one on the back side here, and there's one on the other side here. And the series so far spans about 14 years. In those years, I wasn't doing as much work for myself, and those are more pieces that were self-generated. And the first 4 had this kind of lock and key motif. The 5th one breaks them entirely and just has a very different visual reference to it. But essentially, the series is about introspection, and they're kind of meditations on the value of introspection. And so various times along my career, it's been a recurring theme in my work and in my life. So whenever I feel like I have to get back to that idea, that's when another Exit Within painting comes up. But over time, my ideas about introspection might have changed or might evolve, and the last one, which is 5, on the other side of this wall here, was painted when I was in New York, and so there's these kind of peeling paint of underground subways, and you spend a lot of time in these like cavernous underground places, which are not very amenable, I feel, to the human soul and flourishing, being underground in these peeling apart places. And so the idea of in times like that, in places like that, reaching back and just focusing on the interior life has been important. So all the stuff is more narrative or more just visionary art, and then the hardware stuff is really kind of a left turn in a sense, in that it's still life painting. Like when you go to a museum and you see a still life of like an apple or something like that, like a lot of times it's like, oh, it's just an apple, it's no big deal, whatever. But when you stop and you look at a still life, one thing that I find that it does, for me anyway, is it actually causes you to stop and look at an object in a way that if it was sitting on a table, you wouldn't. So if there's an apple on a table, you'll walk by, you'll be like, whatever, that looks yummy, or it doesn't look yummy, or can I eat that now? But if it's on the wall, you suddenly have to stop, and the fact that it is painted, it kind of ennobles the object in a sense, because it's been made into a work of art, and you have to look at it, and you have to examine it for what it is. And actually, that was one of the things I liked about portraying video game hardware this way. I mean, I'd been doing some still lifes of fruits and vegetables and things like that, and noticing that it was having this effect on something like a tomato. And video game hardware it's never really taken seriously. It's a means to a game end, yes, and parents just see it as a toy when they buy it for their kids or whatever. But to actually see these things that have a big part in people's lives when they're growing up, and the objects themselves as having some kind of value, inherent value to what they are, I find to be very fascinating about focusing on hardware as fine art, I guess.
In what ways do you incorporate that introspection in these paintings, or do you try to avoid incorporating introspection?
It depends on the assignment. Certainly, like if the client is asking you to paint something that really has no room for that, like if they want you to portray another emotion or another a scene that's maybe more action or something like that, then you have to kind of put those personal values aside and focus on what the client wants, whether it's just some kind of cool scene or something aggressive or whatever. But when possible, for instance, this third piece here, The Unknown God, is a story illustration that was done for a magazine, and it had this kind of quiet, personal, almost spiritual moment in it. And it was actually it was easy to tie that to the overall themes of the story in general. It also resonated with that personal value that, like you mentioned, it's something that I was able to express in the illustration and fulfill the needs of the client. So whenever I found an opportunity to do that, I take it because it's kind of a win-win at that point.
Well, if there are no more questions,
Yep.
I would like to thank everyone for coming. I really appreciate people coming out, supporting the gallery and supporting the artists that we show here. Randy this month, who is amazing illustrator, especially considering that he continues to work traditionally nowadays when everyone has gone to digital, which is, I think, kind of brave. So thank you so much, Randy, for being here.
Yeah.
And feel free, everybody, to eat food and look at the art. And if you have any further questions for him, he's here till 9 o'clock. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
A great artist is a great man and a great child.